but we'll wait for people for another minute or two. And then we'll kick off. There's Ingrid. And it will be everybody, it will be translated, yeah. So you'll need to get into the right channel also. That's at one point. Hello, Andres. Good to see you here. Oh, hello.
Hi, Eric, and hello, everyone. How are you?
Very good. How's your job? I think you're at your office.
Yeah, I'm in my office here in Boone, in North Carolina.
Yes.
Hi, Andres.
Because I can see they say kind of the bricks, the bricks it's very university kind of bricks, big ones,
Right.
it's on behind you, behind the window.
Very generic. Yeah.
No, quite opposite. It's not generic. It's very university special. They're very special university bricks. Yeah, kind of the public building. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And how's the students?
It is a public building. It's a public university.
Yeah.
Very good.
How are the students? Are they eager to learn?
You have a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah.
People who are super excited always to learn, others who need some more external motivation.
Yeah. Anyhow, it'll be great to have you, in part of the discussion, which is good. So I think there'll be people coming in as we go, but please do remember that this will be translated into Spanish. So it'll be good. It's important that you actually get into an appropriate channel. So on your bar, on your Zoom, you can select a translation. You can select translation, either English channel, if you would like to listen the speech in English, or if you would like to listen the talk today in Spanish, then please do select a Spanish channel, so that when you are asking questions, then the translator, you can hear the translator coming back to you. Would you like to, Ursula? Would you like to just say this in Spanish so people know what they need to do, please?
Of course.
Thanks.
Buenas tardes, buenos días. Bienvenidos todos. Les recordamos que las charlas de Design Literacy International Network van a ser traducidas del inglés al castellano, de manera que las personas hispanoparlantes puedan elegir la traducción. Para eso tienen que seleccionar el canal del español, que lo encontrarán en el icono del globo que está en la parte baja de su pantalla. Solo tienen que seleccionar el canal inglés o español y escuchar la traducción. Para las personas angloparlantes, también les recomendamos seleccionar el canal del inglés para que puedan oír preguntas en castellano. Eso. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos todos.
Just a quick reminder. This will be translated into Spanish. So if you would like to hear the translation in Spanish, you select interpretation button on your Zoom and select a Spanish channel. If you would like to hear the interpretation in English, do select English channel so that you can hear back any questions that might be or people speaking in Spanish, and it'll translate it back to English. So we'll be kicking off the presentations in the next 20 seconds. But before we start, could you please, Maureen has asked if everyone can just gather a pen and paper, please. So if you have not done yet, which you didn't know that you need a pen and paper, can you please just get a pen and paper? And she has a starting exercise that we'll need pen and paper. Thank you, everybody. So I have one. I have pen and paper ready. Myself, Ursula.
Yes, of course. I have one.
Excellent. Excellent. Maureen, do you have a pen and paper ready?
I do.
Excellent. I'm sure that Andres has his pen and paper because he's in office, and in office in design, industry design office, they'll have lots of pen and papers there. So we'll kick off. So Maureen, would you like to come before we come in? Ursula, would you like to introduce the network, please? Thank you.
Yes, of course. So, well, welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. My name is Ursula Bravo from Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile. On behalf of the Design Literacy International Network, I want to welcome Maureen Carroll, who has kindly accepted our invitation to deliver this talk number 26. I met Maureen Carroll at the School of Stanford. At this time, I was working with Catalina Cortez, Peter Lloyd, and Derek Jones on a project to transfer design tools to Chilean school teachers. Even if Peter and Derek had created the design thinking course for the Open University in the UK, I wanted to know more about other models developed specifically for school context. At Stanford, I could attend an after-school program in Palo Alto and a masterclass taught by Maureen. Both experiences were very inspiring for me. Maureen Carroll is a founder of Lime Design. She has been teaching at the School of Stanford University for over a decade. She was the director of Red Lab, which explores the intersection of design and learning. She has published research in the Journal of Research in STEM Education, the International Journal of Arts and Design Education, Design Studies, Diseño Base e Innovación, among others. Given her brilliant trajectory, she is a very special guest for our Engage with Ideas cycle. As some of you know, Design Literacy International Network seeks to bring together scholars worldwide to discuss and build shared knowledge about design literacy, theoretical concepts, and empirical phenomena. In almost 4 years, our talks, conferences, thematic tracks, and journals special issues have involved more than 50 authors from different countries. Design Literacy International Network holds a critical approach based on Paulo Freire's work. Under this perspective, being literate means regarding the world in all its complexity and participating with autonomy and self-determination to generate social transformation. We have the conviction that design can not only contribute to the material world, but also through its educational approaches, produce the people who will create tomorrow's worlds. Finally, I want to thank everyone who makes this series possible, especially Pia Alvarez, Jasmine Silva, and Malin Thunder. And of course, the institution that supports this and others activity of our network, Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway, Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile, my second home, and Shandong University of Arts and Design in China. Welcome, Maureen. Maureen, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite you to begin with a small exercise that requires you to have a pen and paper. I'm going to tell you a brief story, and I'm going to ask you to sketch what you see, what you imagine as I tell the story.
Just
So
before we go, Maureen.
Yes.
Maureen,
Yeah.
some people have joined us. Sorry to interrupt. Some people have joined us. Just wanted to let them know that it will be really important for them to select the interpretation channel on Zoom. So if they would like to hear this talk in English, do please select the English interpretation channel. And if you would like to hear this talk to be translated into Spanish, then do please select the Spanish button on the interpretation button on your Zoom bar. Thank you, Maureen. Go.
Eric, would you like me to repeat again the instructions?
I think it will be good. No, I think it's good. It's part of the story you're going to be telling about so that people can then start thinking about what to draw.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to start my story. Imagine that there's a small child standing outside a forest. She looks up at a very, very tall tree. Suddenly, she hears chirping and notices a bird in a nest in the tree. As she goes further into the forest, she sees a huge body of water and decides she's going to look even further and see what this water is like. In the background, she sees a house. And as she walks up to the house, she hears the sound of a boat. Now I'm going to ask you to hold up the drawing that you made as I was telling your story.
We need to make the drawing first. Maureen, I need 20 seconds maybe. How's it?
Great, I see so many different drawings. Andres, Eva, Jared, Angela, and Ursula. So I'm going to ask you to drop in the chat. What kind of tree did you draw? Okay, we see pine trees. I even noticed in the drawing many different kinds of trees. Yeah, Jared, yours was a living tree, right? It's imagining the forest this way. I don't know, what is that, Alexandra? What kind of tree is that? Oh, nice, nice. And a spruce, great. Say that again. Great. Nice, and a spruce. And what kind of, now could you drop into the chat, what kind of bird did you draw? Ooh, a cardinal, maybe. Andres drew a cardinal. Sometimes you don't even know what kind of small one, not even what species, just what did you see? Like, what did you notice was there? And a singing, oh, Jared, you even had sound. Great. And generic, Ursula, yeah, that's one sort of your version of what you heard. What kind of water did you draw? Was it a lake, an ocean, a pond? What did you draw? You see lakes, rivers. Even an image, Alexandra, nice. Beautiful tree. And then what did your house look like? What kind of house was it? So Andres, to you, the image came of a log cabin that you're in the forest, a dark wooden house, lots of different things, cabins, right? Different, everybody had a different kind of thing. And last of all, what kind of boat did you draw? What did you see when I was drawing? I see Jared draw a small boat with a motor, a rowing boat, a paddle boat, a fishing boat. So the reason that we began with this exercise is we think about that everybody heard the same words of the story, even being translated in different languages, but everybody heard something different and interpreted in a different way. And when we talk about empathy, we're trying to understand, like, language is our means of conveying that information, but we all heard the same story, yet we all drew different things. And when we teach design and we learn about that, we always want to start with something that is experiential. I could tell you everyone hears a story and does different things, but it's different when you had the chance to actually do that. And we see the very diverse range of houses, trees, boats, bodies of water coming from a simple 3 or 4 sentence story. So I'm going to share this presentation. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet, Maureen.
Not yet, okay. Hang on.
if I see it, I'll say, yep, it's coming up.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great.
Yes. That is.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about what empathy looks like when we look at these design abilities in a K-12 classroom. And this work began at Stanford with David Kelly, who founded Stanford's Design School and was very passionate about education. And one of the parts of Stanford's Design School is the K-12 lab, which works out in the field and at Stanford's Design School to think about what does design look like in the world. So my co-author, Laura McBain, on the article that we're going to share information about today, is the director of the K-12 lab. And Laura and I were really interested in going out and into classrooms and seeing what does design look like out with teachers and students. How does what we thought about it, how does it look like in basically in the field? And
Maureen,
yes.
would you mind just because not everybody might understand what K-12 means.
Yeah.
It's very specified, American, kind of specifically to North America kind of belongs to. Would you mind just
sure. Thank you, and Eric,
please?
Yeah, and please ask me those questions if anything isn't clear as I'm talking. K in the US is kindergarten, so children who are 5 to grade 12, which is when you're ready to start university. So you would be K-12 is end of high school, maybe 18 years old. So those are the years that we focus on in the K-12 lab, calling it the K-12 lab. So Laura and I do a lot of work in the K-12 lab, and also I have Line Design, which actually goes out in the world, and we teach teachers and students design. And our goal is how can we use design as a tool to make change in the world. So we think about design as more than a step-by-step process. When we first, in the early days of the K-12 lab at Stanford, we conceptualized design as a process that had 6 steps, then it had 5 steps, but it was very much along the lines of a recipe of this is how you do things. But what we wanted to do is think more deeply about what design really was. And we thought, what are sort of the underlying abilities and mindsets that frame the true meaning of design rather than simply following a process filled with steps that were very constrained in how you would enact them. So we think about how do we use design? How do we define it as a way of being that challenges us to become observant, like noticing, and that how can we be more empathetic, be more curious, and kind of rethink and be open to how can we think about what does education really look like? And that's what framed our journey. This is probably a very familiar way to think about design. And we go through these different steps. We frame design challenges, and this is how people understand what design is. But when we started thinking more deeply, we wanted to think beyond the steps and go more deeper into what we defined as design abilities. One metaphor we used is thinking of the design thinking process was a single song, but the design abilities were 8 different notes. And when you think about that, it's almost, if you think about a musical analogy, you might learn, if you know what the different notes are, you can create melodies and different kinds of songs rather than a single song, a simpler way of thinking about design. So when we define design abilities, we talk about design abilities are behaviors that emphasize what students are learning and recognize the habits they're developing.
Are you trying to move your slides, Maureen?
Yeah.
Here we go. Yep.
Yep.
It's moving now. Perfect.
These are the design abilities that we have identified. Carissa Carter, who's the head of the teaching and learning at Stanford at the design school, came up with this idea of how would we define design abilities. So again, this metaphor of let's think about how can we use these design abilities to understand more deeply what we want our students to learn and how we want them to understand the design process. So what Laura and I did is think about, there was one design ability that we wanted to reframe, and that was the idea of learning from others. And what we wanted to think about is, instead of just learning from others, we wanted to think about, could we translate that to mean learning from and with others? And the reason that we did that is because we wanted to think about how empathy was not a transaction where we're trying to take information from the person we're designing for. And I think initially that was how we were thinking about this empathy experience. Like, we are going to interview you and we're going to take information from you. And instead, I seem to have a problem moving my screen forward.
What happens if you use your mouse?
Yeah, I don't have a mouse, it's a touch screen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and you cannot see the
Yeah, seems
what
like
happens if, yeah, there we go, done.
Yeah.
Or you maybe skip something, yeah?
Yeah.
What if you use arrows on your keyboard? Left
Yeah,
and right
that is
arrow?
what I'm using. Yeah.
Ah, it's
It's
not
just
like
lagging. Yeah, it's possible. So we think about, instead, empathy is sort of a co-constructed act. And this ability to empathize requires this idea that you must practice and be intentional about how you're doing this. I'm not sure why my screen is not responding.
Yeah, I can hear, we can hear that you're trying to move it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hang on a second.
Yeah. It was right down. There was, I saw slide 15.
Oh,
There we
hang
go.
on.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Whoa,
that's it.
whoa,
Oh,
whoa. Now it's moving.
it is moving, yes.
All right, so
Great.
we thought about, okay, how can we, if we're going to conceptualize this design ability as not just learning from others, but learning with others, we thought about, okay, well, what does that look like in a design-driven, learner-centered classroom? And we thought it starts and ends with empathy. And the first part of that, and this is what we learned by doing the work in the field, talking to teachers, having them look at this ability and think about what did it mean for their practice. And we realized that it had to be, students had to have a stake in what they're learning. It had to matter to them. And different approaches like project-based learning take advantage of that. And we also realized that in order for students to have a stake in what they were learning, they had to go out in the world. They had to have that curiosity to want to know what are problems that are out there that are worth solving. And the issue as educators is there's content that we want to teach them. So we're always like trying to negotiate what's that sweet spot between students' curiosity and the creativity and their learning. And that was constantly a juggle for the teachers. And there was this tension between, we want to give them ownership, but we also want to share things with them that we would hopefully have them teaching. And the goal was that we want them to be problem finders. An essential part of being a designer is thinking about not simply rushing to be a problem solver, but having that curiosity and willingness to go out and be a problem finder. And sometimes that's even more challenging as both for the students and for the teachers. Katie Martin, a colleague, in her book, Evolving Education, talked about how do schools move from being school-centered, having school-centered to learner-centered experiences. And I think she does a really good job of thinking about what would that look like if we shift the focus. So we think about empathy from one-on-one. Katie addresses it more from the system level. And what she talks about and what we realize is that the relationships and the social emotional learning are the foundation of those effective learning communities. When students have a stake in what they're learning, you're able to develop those relationships and you're able to acknowledge what that social emotional component of learning looks like. We also came to the notion that empathy embodies belonging. And we hear a lot about belonging today. That's a word that people are thinking about. What does belonging look like in the world of education? What we found is that we kind of wanted to address this idea that students are not coming to us empty. They come to us with this rich, wonderful life experiences. And we, as educators, need to create that classroom culture where students know that they're valued and that who they are really matters to us. One approach that really helps in creating that kind of culture is called liberatory design. And in that, it's a more robust way to think about the design process because it includes the extra steps of noticing, reflecting, trying to understand what's your equity commitment and how do you understand the complexity of this. So there's this cycle that continually returns to looking at, noticing what's happening, reflecting on that, embedded within a design process. Another way that looks at how to create that kind of culture and that sense of belonging are three different things that we came across. One was something we noticed that the National Council of Teachers of English talked about was disrupt text. The other was Louise Moll's work on funds of knowledge and Escobar's pluriverse. In disrupt text, it was broadening what were the possible texts that you could use in a classroom. So we can look at continuously interrogating our own biases and how they inform our thinking. 4 different steps that really made people think about how can I think differently about building that culture of belonging in my classroom. Louise Moll's work focused on this idea that within a community, there are funds of knowledge. There's so much richness and depth and breadth of knowledge that communities have that students bring to our classroom. He talked about the importance of making sure that we include those resources, the families, the community, as part of the education system. And how can we leverage that to foster this sense of belonging so that school doesn't seem like this other thing, but it's something that's embedded in the culture and the joy that surrounds our own communities. Escobar's pluriverse, that was kind of an interesting way, I'd not heard of this before, was thinking about how design within this framework of belonging could change and think about ways of being and doing that are attuned to justice and the earth. So all of those different ways of thinking help us reframe what belonging looks like and what role empathy plays in the learning process. The University Innovation Fellows was started by a colleague of mine at Stanford. And one thing an exercise that she did with her community was the idea of thinking about inclusivity, because inclusivity is a really important part of belonging. What she did is she had her students think about what their favorite childhood game was. And then kind of that switch, that empathetic reframe is who might not be able to play this game. And then think about that group that couldn't play the game and generate ideas to redesign the game so they could participate. And sometimes we what's most important about this is the reframe. Like, think differently. Belonging and inclusivity require us as educators to think differently about how we can make sure that our classroom culture embodies a sense of belonging. Susie Wise is the person who wrote the book, the recent book called On Design for Belonging. And one of the things Susie was thinking about is, can you design for moments of belonging? She talked about belonging as something that you feel, you see, and you shape. Most importantly, you can shape that. And you think about what are those moments in your classrooms that you can design interventions that foster that sense of belonging. So she talks about different levers, maybe the way you group things, maybe there are incentives, rituals. What does the space look like? Just kind of helped us rethink some very actionable ways to foster that sense of belonging in the classroom. So ultimately, what we're looking at is, how can we think about empathy by being aware of your own bias, race, and privilege, and requires us to take action. And in that, we talked about, oh my goodness, that having the idea that we need to be both aware and humble and address the structures and behaviors in our classrooms that systematically marginalize our most oppressed students. Because we think about empathy, ultimately in our classrooms, is about building those relationships with our students. That's one thing we noticed during the pandemic, is we intensely miss those moments when you're walking to your classroom, or you're having a coffee break, or students are filtering out of the classroom. And it's those times when you're asking them, what do they do on the weekend? Or, how are they feeling? You would have those conversations. And I think those relationships happen, sometimes those moments we have to cultivate by having those moments, but showing the students that we really care about them, who they are, not just who they are as learners in our classroom. When we think about empathy, this was a really interesting quote that I thought Brene Brown said, is the idea that empathy, we need to dispel the myth that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes, and learn how to listen to the story you tell us about what it's like in your shoes, and believe you even when it doesn't match my experiences. And to me, this was a very powerful quote, because we always hear empathy is walk in someone else's shoes, as though it was so easy to do that. We think about the exercise that we just started with, we all heard the same story, we all experience it very differently. So acknowledging when it doesn't match my experiences maybe is the hardest part of creating that empathy in your classroom. To do that, this is kind of what we learned, this idea that practicing awareness, practicing humility, and then also changing those behavior structures. I talked a little bit about those authentic moments, and to do that kind of led to this idea that when we ask those questions and we want to hear those stories, we find that we're learning as much as we teach. And for me, that is the most teachable moments, is that when we have the opportunity to be learners and kind of create a learning community where there's a balance of both of these different things. So the designability of learning from and with others gives us that chance to be humble, to be curious, to be vulnerable, and to have that deep empathy, something that is the way that we're going to move towards 21st century learning. And I apologize for this dancing computer that is not letting us go on the different slides. And together, we want to continue that journey of keeping the learning together. And I think that we haven't answered all those questions. This journey that we went on was a chance to see what are the questions that we need to ask, and how can we continue to keep learning together with and from others. I think, Eric, we're going to open the floor if there's any questions.
Yes. Thank you, Maureen. If anyone has any questions, do please come in. I have a question, Maureen, and I mean, this is kind of more broader question, and it reminds me listening to your talk and about trying to open up different ways how you can, I guess, see the world. You're trying to open up the possibilities both for the teachers and the students, that the world is actually is not one linear kind of ways of understanding it. And it reminds me that's what the critical theory, cultural theory is trying to do. And I was reading in a Washington Post, they covered that quite a lot. What's happening in the schools in the US, banning the books, and which some people deem inappropriate for the children, and how actually we how the pupils are taught about how to actually understand the history of the slavery in USA and so on. And it's becoming narrower and narrower from what I've read. So my question is this: it's about how does the approach you're trying to promote with your through your courses and through teachers and so on, what you just described, and how is that challenging what's happening in the US currently, and how does it kind of comes together essentially?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really have an answer to that question. I think the best way to describe that is we recently did this workshop with teachers on ChatGPT, and we were thinking about how could we take this resource that to some people is fearful, like it's about plagiarism and it's about what is it going to do to our classrooms, and how can we use it as a resource so that we can teach students to be critical thinkers about that. And I think in all education, that when you have the opportunity to, reminds me of how media literacy came about. Like you wanted your students to be critical thinkers. Now they had access to lots of information through technology. And the same way, every new technology that comes along, the same way that different issues come along, what we want is our students to be critical, informed, empowered thinkers. So I think, and I think it is very challenging, and it's a very complex issue with many different parts and opinions on how to do that. But as educators, I feel like it's important for us to teach our students how to be that kind of critical thinker, because it's very hard to do that. Even as adults, it's hard to, filter through the noise and think about that. So that's what I think as educators, our goal should be for that.
I have one more question, Maureen, and then I'll come to other people. And the question is about, there was a slide where you had, I think it was the 8, design abilities, if I remember correctly. If you're teaching those abilities, or you're trying to get, your students, that is the teachers, I assume, to understand, these abilities and how they can incorporate them into their teaching and learning, with the pupils. How do you assess your students, how they understand those abilities? What are the assessment kind of approaches you do, in your class?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that you always come back to in different ways. So one of the things that we have tried to focus on a lot is reflection. So we think about how we used to give students prompts at the end of each class, and they would respond to that, and then we would share them collectively as a group. Sometimes we would take what everyone had written anonymously, print them out, cut them in strips, divide the next class, we would give them to the students. So everyone sort of had a broad sector of different responses to this assessment, and then they would talk about what they learned, and that kind of pushed things to another level. But what we found is we were kind of stuck on this one question idea. So we designed another way to look at it, which was we would ask them what happened or what did they learn, and then so what, which would be like, why does it matter? And then now what, which is going to be, how are they going to use it? And we found that suddenly we were getting deeper and more robust reflections that led to deeper learning for us and for them. The other thing we are doing, I'm working on a project now that looks at using machine learning as a way to understand students' transformation as learners. So we gave them the sentence called, I used to think and now I think. And we would do, so my part in that project was to look at the qualitative data analysis of that and look at what happened in students. We would give them, every student would answer this prompt at the end of a class. We have about 1,500 responses now, and we're training an algorithm to see if that would respond the same way that my coding would respond. And I think sometimes the what, so what, and now what, that was more elaborate response, but this really concise sentence, I used to think and now I think, also gave us insight into how did students change? What did they learn? And what a broad and beautiful range of responses we got that really showed us how they were understanding these design abilities, such as navigating ambiguity and rapid experimentation, learning from and with others, very different ways to look at that. But I think, as you said, Eric, it's always, assessment is always a complicated issue, and you want to find different ways to see if what you think you're teaching is really what you're teaching. And I think that's a little bit like the empathy being a co-constructed act is very similar.
Yes, that was that's very good. Thank you so much, Maureen. And that actually takes us about the empathy. There's a question from Ursula, so I'll ask her to come in. There's also then next one we'll have it from Andres, and I think then afterwards it will be good if Eva can come in, because lots of things I think resonates with me, at least, whatever in Oslo Met University is trying to do in her day-to-day work, and what you were describing. And if anybody else has other questions, then we'll come to it. So Ursula, would you like to come in, and then we have Andres?
Thank you, Eric. Well, I think it's very interesting to stress the traditional definition of empathy. But based on your experience, Maureen, how will you define empathy?
Yeah, I think, Ursula, the biggest difference in kind of how I'm rethinking what empathy is the idea of extracting information from a user rather co-constructing information. I think the idea that you're learning from and with others really changed how I think about empathy. We do this exercise where it's an improv exercise that really sort of, to me, embodies what empathy looks like. And we would have people move together, like mirror. You would make a movement and your partner would mirror the same movement as you were doing. And the way we started the exercise is person A was the leader and person B would follow. And then we would say, okay, now person B is the leader and person A would follow. And then what would happen as we continued this, we would say, now imagine there is no leader. And suddenly you were almost moving synchronously with your partner, because you couldn't see who was person A and who was person B. And I think, to me, that sort of embodies what empathy is like. You're having this interaction and you can't really take yourself out of it. It's almost like an anthropologist, like participant observer continuum, like an anthropologist watching versus you're there. Like, even if you're a fly in the classroom as a researcher, you're there, your presence is there. And I think before I kind of thought, well, you sort of pretend you're not there and you're either taking notes or recording students when you're doing research, but you are there. And I think acknowledging that and thinking about how empathy is that co-constructed act, to me, that's how my definition of empathy changed.
All right. Andres, would you like to come in?
Yeah, Eric, thank you. And Maureen, thank you so much for your presentation. I have been following your work since 2010 when I was doing my master's, and it's a pleasure to get to meet you, even though it's not in person, through Zoom.
Thank you so much.
My question, I have plenty of questions. My dissertation, actually, my doctoral dissertation actually was about empathy in design. But I have one question, and is so in design thinking and in design, empathy is used for learning and connecting to the people for whom we design, right? For users and stakeholders. However, the type of relationship that we have in the classroom with students is very different than the relationship that users and designers have. So how do you transfer techniques or methods or practices from, well, the design practice to the classroom to facilitate the construction of an empathic relationship between students and teachers and educators?
Yeah, I think it's like, you're acknowledging that sort of a power imbalance, right? Because you are the authority. And I think it's a way to, there's a concept that I learned about called shared authority in the classroom. It's like, how do you have that continuum of, giving student ownership? And I think in the presentation, I talked about that. And I think you really have honed in on that sweet spot, right? Because you want the students to be the problem finders. And that's an important part of being a designer. But you also know that maybe they need some content learning in order to solve that design challenge. So there's two different ways. One is if you as an educator are designing your classroom to be a design classroom, then you're going to think about empathy as a way to find that place to let students be part of it. But if you're going to teach students to run design challenges, that's kind of a different relationship also, right? Because you're teaching them to make sure when they interview somebody that they're kind of asking the right kind of questions and being an empathetic listener to do that. So I think there's different threads of how you translate that user. Like, what does that really mean, the stakeholder? Are you designing for your students? Are you designing with them? That's one way to look at it. The other way is to look at how can you help them be, I guess, really ask the kind of questions and be an empathetic designer for them. So it's like, I think it really gets to the idea of that design isn't step. Design is mindsets, right? And mindsets, those design abilities represent that. And I think looking at all those design abilities, and then you think about how do they translate, what do they mean to you as an educator? And then how can you make them actionable for your students? So, but happy to talk to you more offline after this about that. It's a really interesting question.
Thank you, Maureen.
All right. We have then Eva. I would like to bring you in, and then we have Francesco afterwards after Eva. Eva.
Thank you, Eric, for considering me. I can see why you want me to go on screen, and thank you, Maureen, for your excellent talk. It gives me a lot of inspiration. Actually, now I teach architecture for kids that are 15 to 16 years old, and I pose a problem for them, and how could they connect, and how could I really make them want to do the task and want to be curious and get into the real design challenges that are there. And then I think even though some of them have lots of experience of designing cabins, being outdoors in the forests, and some have never been there, but everyone has lived in a home. They have some experience, and how can I kind of put the threshold so low that everyone can connect to their previous experiences and this. And for the conference that we have in China, we had this track on empathy, and also how they could step into the problems that are really worth solving. But it's a problem, right? If it's the teacher that has decided what problems are worth solving. So for the students really to be engaged, it needs to be their discovering and their choice, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. It's like, how do you do that? But one way that you and sort of deal with that. I think if you start with a paired design challenge, like a one-on-one design challenge, and you might tell them like, how might we design maybe a new room in a home, or how might we design, if you wanted to like bring in like climate action, how might we design something? But the beauty of design is if you design for one person, your goal is ultimately that it will benefit a larger community, but you dig into the nuance of that one user experience. So I think if you had your students do that paired activity and go through an entire design challenge and then share out what those prototypes were and look at the feedback, then I think you would get them to, I think that would take care of sort of a little bit of the engagement, like, why are we doing this? Because I noticed like anytime we do a paired design challenge, the conversation and the buzz that happens around them is like, people want to be heard and want to be listened to. So sometimes rather than throwing out this big class assignment, when you have that one-on-one student interaction, that's one technique. Another is to take them out. Maybe it's like you're saying, a forest or an urban center, and then let everyone come back and spend that time, maybe spend the whole hour being problem finders and have them have notebooks and notice what's not working. Does the door not open this way? Is it too crowded here? Are people lining up? And then they feel like they've identified, you framed it as maybe it's an urban challenge, but they have chosen what part of that did they notice and did they see as a problem worth solving?
I agree. We are explicitly teaching them to work with design dialogues this year, and for them to acknowledge what it means to talk to the other, and to listening into and not just sit there and try to solve the problem themselves. So it's easy peasy, small tricks to do, but
very vitally important, to do that. And then you've changed design from being a process to being sort of a living thing that embodies these abilities and these mindsets that really are what being a designer is about, rather than now I'm on the empathize portion, now I'm on the define portion, right? You've sort of changed. They've given them more ownership and empowerment.
Hello, Pilar. Pilar. Would you mind just muting yourself? Yeah, Francesco, would you like to come in?
Okay, thanks so much. Hope the connection is stable because I'm in Portugal and I'm not sure if it's okay. Congratulations, I follow only half of the conversation. And my question is this. Look like that you reinterpret empathy, that in Greek is pathos, under pathos, behind pathos, but pathos is sentiment, is something like a positive sentiment, but pathos is also suffering. And look like that when we talk about empathy, helping, collaboration, working together, we have this kind of positive knowledge in design that it's fantastic, it's super, but if you also follow the idea of awareness of Dreyfus and Dreyfus, now moving from expertise to master and from master to leader, you have to suffer. And the question is, how, based on your experience, you think that suffering, brutality, suffering also in a physical and a psychological way, even if I know that it's not easy to talk about these kind of things after pandemia with this kind of uncertainty, but this is also important for learning and developing awareness, because in Greek, empathy is a sentiment, but also suffering. I don't know if it's clear, the question, and thanks so much.
Yeah, and I think that is what empathy is. Empathy is just not the positive empathy, and it's not sympathy, right? Is that what pathos is like, more like sympathy? Is that what you meant?
My point is how we can teach suffering in design, how we can implement suffering when we educate, because this is also a critical point, because in a private university we have clients, and we cannot say to them we are here to let you suffer. There is also a corruption in this kind of learning process. I don't know if it's clear the point.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying, that's what empathy is. Empathy is a wide range of emotions. And that empathy is like, you want to empathize with who you're designing for. So if that, I mean, that's designed as a problem solving problem finding approach. So of course you're going to have all those difficult emotions. So when you're empathizing with someone through interviews and trying to understand their experience, even if it's not your own, then you are addressing that. And that is what empathy is. So I agree with you.
Thanks so
I
much.
think-
And congratulations. Thanks so much.
I think Francesca, that's a great question, and it's a it's an important thing to unpack, as we go. And I think that it's quite important to actually to think about how these terms are used in design and how we understand them. And I think what Maureen just expressed, that's how Maureen understands the term and how they're using it. But yeah, there are other ways. One, how can they actually understand and to be empathetic? It's you're supposed to be in shoes of somebody else. But how can you be, if you are 5-year-old or 10-year-old or 15-year-old, how can you be in the shoes of 70-year-old person?
Yeah.
It's just quite impossible, isn't it? It's quite difficult.
Yeah.
And
I think what Andres pointed out too about the pain points, he's right. We do talk about pain points because pain points are where things are not working, and that's where the opportunity to design is. We're designing for a moment in time, and that whatever that embodies, it's not going to happen unless we have the empathy for the person that we're designing for.
I think we have Magdalena has a question. Would you like to come in, Magdalena, please?
Hi. I have a Mediterranean culture too. I agree with the opinion of Francesco about it, because we have to learn about suffering. The idea at the school is that you have to resist. We talk now more about resilience than empathy. So we have to teach it more than empathy. But I'm curious because I can understand this method if applied with kids. I'm critic if we have to try to apply it with teenagers, because they start from a point that they are critical at all. So I think it is difficult to manage a class with these particular kind of people, because with adults you are talking about someone that has his own opinion but is stable. And kids are open to everything, and they are more open-minded than adults. But teenagers, I'm curious. You apply this kind of approach with them, and with the kind of exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the different empathy exercises that have been helpful is like we'll have them. One thing we did is have them go around a school campus in a wheelchair. See what was it like to be in a wheelchair. We have exercises. We actually had a student who was blind, partially blind, legally blind in one of our classes, and he had us, he created a meal for us, and we had to eat with not being able to see what we were eating. So I think exercises, I do think that teenagers, they have great capacity to be empathetic, and I think we have to give them practice to do that and acknowledge that. I think maybe we think that they can't do that. We worked with, let's see, they were 11, 12, 13-year-olds. That's the project where Ursula came to visit us. And they were able to empathize, but it does take more, it just doesn't happen, right? You want to structure those activities. Anything that gives them an opportunity to see what it's like to be someone else, whether it's physically. I remember one of our colleagues did an exercise about carrying water jugs. She was working on a water project, and what was it like to actually have to carry huge gallons? So she had her students carry huge amounts of water, and she was doing a project about irrigation. And what if you had to walk 3 miles to a well to get fresh water? And you could tell somebody about that, but if you had them actually feel what that was like, you sort of, as educators, forefront the empathy piece. Another student had it was actually one of our students came up with this idea when he was teaching the middle schoolers. He had a lot of students they didn't have electricity, or electricity would go off in their homes at night. So he had the students go into a closet, a broom closet, with a tiny one of those tea lights, and try and read like a puzzle to get them to understand, oh, this is what it's like to not have brilliant, you know, turn on your electricity whenever you want it. So I think any of those kind of exercises lend themselves to those kind of things.
All right, we have a last question that, I mean, there's more and more. It looks like you've, you know, your presentation has, your talk, Maureen, has, you know, it was very good because it as you can see, there's lots of responses and interest around the ideas you were discussing. But Andreas, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, no, my question is, so how do we move from empathy to compassion, which is a much more committed and engaged way to create and build a relationship with others?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about. I hadn't thought about. Do you believe that compassion is the enactment of empathy?
I think it goes beyond. Empathy, for me, it's understanding and feeling what the other person feels. Compassion is taking action, as you mentioned, coming closer to the other person, wanting the other person not to suffer, wanting the other person to be happy, to have their needs met. So I think it's much more committed, much more engaged than empathy. If we think of a scale, it's like we have sympathy, then empathy, and then compassion. So that's how I see it. So how do we move from this in the empathy stage to the more closer stage, a compassion stage?
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. I had never thought of it that way before, but it does seem to embody some kind of action, and which is your whole point of design. Design isn't just about, you know, this part. It's like, what am I going to do now that I'm attacking this problem? How can I have impact in the world? So yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but I like that. I like that version of moving towards the action of compassion.
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we need to have, you know, a couple of talks, I think, focusing, or maybe even a symposium focusing on the topic of empathy and what it actually means and how it can be taught or cannot be taught, and, you know, is it, you know, what are the kind of the turns and twists, you know, using that term. And I think it'll be really nice to have that discussion and have a symposium. And it will be really good to, you know, have maybe round table and discussions around this, and you know, what are the pros and cons, you know, of that, and where the terminology is coming from. And yeah, I think we should, you know, do this sometimes in a you know, this year or next year, to do this. And you know, Magdalena and Andres and you know, Maureen and other people to invite, Eva, you know, and think about, you know, is it something that we want to use as a term, or it's you know, is it something that maybe needs to be replaced with something else? And you know, what sort of exercises people use and so on. So it's great discussion, I think, today. And so again, thank you very much, Maureen, for today's talk. I have very much enjoyed the talk, and you can see from the, you know, engagement with people, you know, there was a good engagement. So Ursula, would you like to come in and to introduce the next month talk, please? Thank you.
Por supuesto, muchas gracias, Eric. Pero antes de presentar la siguiente charla, quiero volver a dar las gracias a Maureen por acompañarnos en este ciclo. Creo que la discusión ha sido muy interesante, sobre todo poder contrastar distintas visiones desde distintas trayectorias, como Francesco desde la filosofía, Maureen desde su experiencia en escuelas, también Eva, Andrés desde su propia experiencia en su doctorado. Creo que ha sido una gran discusión. También gracias, Eric, porque sé que allá en Australia es muy tarde en la noche y estás ahí como siempre con mucha energía. Nuestra próxima charla, les voy a mandar aquí voy a compartir el flyer. Nuestro próximo invitado es Guillermo Marini. Él es académico de la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad Católica, tiene formación en filosofía y su doctorado es en educación. hizo creo que el máster en filosofía en Harvard y su doctorado es en Columbia. Y sus temas de investigación se relacionan con la estética cotidiana en la escuela. Su charla va a ser Everyday Aesthetic in Education, Designing Temporal Experience in Schools. O sea, estéticas cotidianas en la educación, diseñando la experiencia temporal en la escuela. Tiene una trayectoria bien interesante analizando el espacio material, la sensorialidad material de la escuela y también cómo se va comunicando el tiempo en la escuela. La charla va a ser el primer martes de abril, esto es el 4 de abril, en los horarios que ustedes ven ahí, y les mandaremos información como todos los meses para que se puedan inscribir y los estaremos esperando, ojalá que se entusiasmen con esta próxima charla.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll close the session now. And I would like to thank also to the translator Yasmin, for doing the translation for us and making it possible for other people, from who speak Spanish, being able to join us and participate in today's talk.
Eric, muy importante recordar que la charla va a quedar grabada para que puedan volver a mirarla si no la han visto entera o si la quieren ver de nuevo, tanto en el sitio web de Design Literacy International Network como en UDD TV. Si nos escriben, nos mandan un correo, les podemos enviar el enlace. Nos vamos a demorar un par de días en subirlo, pero va a estar disponible.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.